Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good. That was a good response, actually. Good morning, everybody. Let's try this again. Good morning, everybody. Yes. Thank you to all of you that are on time at 9 a.m. on a Friday morning. I know we'll be joined by a few others, but appreciate the commitment to be here on time. I'm Andrew Seeley. I'm Executive Vice President here on behalf of Jane Harmon, our President, who's out of town today. And we're particularly pleased today to host a conversation on a topic of critical importance by one of our own, Rob Litwak. On the Iran nuclear deal. And as I will say in a minute, this is both timely, because this is obviously in the headlines and it is the debate of the day, but it is also timeless. And Rob raises questions that go beyond what is simply being debated in the Senate. And there was a vote yesterday, but there will be a vote again next week. This will continue to reverberate for some time. But the real importance of what's going on in the U.S.-Iran relationship is a much longer-term question that Rob deals with in this book. As you all saw yesterday, and as our moderator, David Sanger, former scholar here and New York Times correspondent, who we're very pleased to have back here, wrote yesterday in the New York Times, the Democrats in the Senate managed to ensure yesterday that the Iran nuclear deal will take effect. Using the filibuster, this will come up. Senator McConnell said it'll come up again next week for a vote, but we can be fairly certain at this point that it is the debate in the Senate is probably over. However, the impact of the Iran nuclear deal and the broader question of U.S.-Iran relations is something that is a much larger question that will go on for some time. And it will have huge effects in the U.S. body politic for some time as well. We're here this morning to discuss the deal and to launch the second edition of the Wilson Center's own Rob Litwak's book, Iran Nuclear Chess After the Deal. Fabulous book. There are copies out there and there are copies online as well. I should note, as our director and CEO Jane Harmon often says, the Wilson Center is a family, and it is a testament to that family that Rob has dedicated this most recent monograph to Michael Adler, a Wilson Center public policy scholar, an expert on Iran, and a longtime reporter for Agence France-Presse, who passed away last year, and a good friend of many of us here, and we miss him. And it's a great tribute to Michael that you dedicated this to him. Rob is the Wilson Center's Vice President for Scholars and Academic Relations and the Director of International Security Studies. In his spare time, he's an adjunct professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Service and a consultant to the Los Alamos Laboratory. He has been working on these issues for a number of years. He has looked at rogue states, outlier states, at how you bring in countries that are outside, how you use diplomatic efforts to bring isolated states back into the international community. And this book is very much part of that work that he's done through the years. And I should also highlight that Halis Fandiari, Dr. Halis Fandiari, wrote the foreword of this, who is the Director Emeritus of our Middle East program, and we're very pleased to have her with us today. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this session, a man who probably doesn't need much of an introduction, David Sanger. Thank you, David, for coming back here. He is the national security correspondent for the New York Times. He has reported from New York, Tokyo, and Washington, covering a variety of issues, including, of course, nuclear proliferation, and has twice been a member of teams that have won the Pulitzer Prize. He's also written 2 books, one of which I think was mostly written at the Wilson Center.
That's right.
So he is part of the family here as well, and we're very glad always when he comes back and agrees to participate and lead insightful discussions on issues that he knows an enormous deal about. We're pleased that he's able to lead this important conversation today, and let me turn it over to, Bruce Gendelson, I think, is here before I turn it over. Bruce, good to have you back, one of our global fellows as well. Now let me turn it over to David.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming at this early hour of the morning. It's always good, Rob, to have an audience at 9 a.m. because the number of people who we can actually see falling asleep is usually low. But in this particular case, I'm not worried about it, both because of the compelling nature of the news about this and the compelling nature of what Rob has written. Many of you may have seen the earlier version a year ago of this book, and that really laid out a set of challenges for what the Obama administration needed to do with the deal and also with the region. A year later, we've seen what the deal is going to look like, all the questions about what its effects are going to be on the region and so forth remain and will be a subject of great scholarship, I'm sure, here and certainly of our discussion. It's particularly good to be back here at Wilson. I have to say there's no better place to go find a little refuge to write a book and do some thinking. I was very privileged to write The Inheritance here, which was now believe it or not, 7 years ago. Hard to believe. And it's great to see so many old friends here, to see Halle here in the front, and for a book that is dedicated to Michael, who we all miss, and I particularly missed as we were stuck in Vienna for 3 weeks. I guess I learned in the course of this, Rob, that if you send emails that say that you're stuck in Vienna, you don't get any sympathy from your colleagues. But we went through many weeks of this and Lausanne before it, and it would have been particularly fun to have Michael's running analysis during the drinks in the evening, which there's plenty of time for while everybody was locked up in the group. So Rob, let me start with this. As I said, the last book you laid out the challenge. In this book, you've got a different set of challenges, as the subtitle indicates, which is after the deal. So tell us, what are your big conclusions about how the deal sets us up for the next few years?
Great. I think the Wilson Center's mission could be encapsulated by a single word: context. And this book attempts to provide a context for these current the negotiations that have come to fruition in this deal. The Iran nuclear deal is the first arms control agreement to pass on a straight party line vote. The nuclear deal has been called a milestone and an historic chance by its supporters, an act of appeasement, and an historic mistake by its opponents. On the surface, the deal is a straightforward trade-off between technology and transparency. Iran is permitted to retain a limited nuclear program in return for assurances that that program is not masquerading for a weapons program. But getting to yes has been anything but straightforward. It required protracted negotiations with Iran, and it's generated the acrimonious debate in this country that we've seen playing out on Capitol Hill recently. And this brings me to the first of 3 points. My central argument is that in both Iran and America, the nuclear issue remains a proxy for a more fundamental debate. In Iran, it is a surrogate for the defining debate over the Islamic Republic's relationship with the outside world. Whether, in former President Rafsanjani's words, the Islamic Republic is a revolutionary state or an ordinary country. In America, the nuclear challenge is embedded in the broader issue of American strategy towards so-called rogue states since 9/11. The Bush administration argued that the threat posed by the rogues derived from the very character of their regimes. Hence, behavior change would not get you there because the behavior was inextricably linked to the character of the regimes. This argumentation was central to the case for a preventive war of regime change in Iraq in 2003. President Obama campaigned in 2008 on the controversial platform of engaging adversarial states. He reframed the debate on Iran, dropping the unilateral American rogue rubric, and instead, in a memorable interview with David Sanger, characterized the Islamic Republic as an outlier, a state violating established international norms. The Tehran regime was given a structured choice: come into compliance with Iran's obligations under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, or face punitive measures and deeper isolation. This recasting of the Iranian nuclear challenge helped forge broad multilateral support for the tough financial and oil sanctions that brought Iran back to the negotiating table under the reformist president Hassan Rouhani. Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, acquiesced to Rouhani's nuclear diplomacy, but remained the final arbiter of the agreement hammered out in Vienna. Khamenei's dilemma is how to manage Iran's unresolved identity crisis: revolutionary state, ordinary country. On the nuclear deal, it came down to a hard calculation whether the political costs of an agreement, alienating hardline interest groups, especially the Revolutionary Guard, those groups upon which the regime depends upon for its survival, whether those costs would outweigh the economic benefits of an agreement through sanctions relief. The dilemma of the Iranian nuclear challenge is that Iran has mastered uranium enrichment. Centrifuges that spin to produce low-enriched uranium for nuclear power reactors can keep spinning to yield highly enriched uranium for bombs. Since nuclear diplomacy with Iran has been focused on bounding, not eliminating Iran's uranium enrichment program, the regime will retain an option, a hedge for a nuclear weapon. The US red line for the deal was that the breakout period for converting this latent capability into a weapon should be at least a year. And that brings me to my second point. What came to fruition in Vienna was a deal, not a grand bargain. As a deal, the nuclear accord is transactional, not transformational. That is, it addresses a discrete, urgent national security challenge, but does not affect the character of the Iranian regime. What the Obama administration hails as the agreement's great strength, that it buys 15 years, its critics see as its great weakness. It only buys 15 years. And at the end of that period, the revolutionary regime will still be in power with its nuclear hedge and a shrinking breakout time. The crux of their criticism is that the deal is only transactional, not transformational. Because recall, for the critics, the threat derives from the character of the Tehran regime. For many of the critics, the issue is not this deal with Iran, but any deal with Iran under this regime. After the Senate's vote, attention will now shift to the challenges of implementing the agreement, even as Iran remains the leading state sponsor of terrorism and is pursuing an activist foreign policy. And that is my third and final point to initiate this conversation. We need a strategy suited to this long game with Iran. The term containment has been banished from our foreign policy lexicon. The disavowal of containment by policymakers across the political spectrum is a reflection of the meaning the term has taken on in our contemporary debate. That is, acquiescing to Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons and then deterring their use through the retaliatory threat of US nuclear weapons. That connotation is an unfortunate departure from George Kennan's concept of containment, which was keeping regimes in check until they collapsed of their own internal weakness, collapsed or evolved. Obama is essentially pursuing an updated version of Kennan's strategy. He's decoupling the nuclear issue from the question of regime change, and he's relying on internal forces as the agent of societal change. I've spoken somewhat telegraphically, but those would be three broad takeaway points from this study, points that I hope would enlighten our public policy discourse as we proceed now into the implementation of this agreement.
Well, Rob, it's a great intro to all of this, so let me just try to press you a little bit on a few of these points. So let's start with your first one, which was that this is, in fact, the first big arms control agreement that didn't have some fairly broad measure of bipartisan support. Almost all through the Cold War, you got to those. So what does that tell you for the possibilities of implementing this? Because the first time something goes wrong, and something will go wrong because we're dealing with Iran here, and we're dealing with a sanctions regime that many don't want to fully give up. So either the Iranians are going to say you're not complying, or we're going to say you're cheating around the edges, which gets to your point. That could take us immediately to a fairly divisive argument here of "I told you so." So I guess my first question is, does the narrow way that the president won, basically on a voting technicality, he obviously didn't have a majority of votes to do this, does that in any way pose a long-term challenge for implementing the deal fully from the US side?
The vote yesterday is viewed within the polarized context of our politics. But I pulled the optic back and not refrained from engaging the issue in those terms. I framed it very much in terms of this persisting debate on the US side of whether the threat posed by these regimes was it behavior change or regime change that we're pursuing, this issue of threat linked to the character of the regime. The hallmark of the Iranian nuclear program is ambiguity. Their strategic sweet spot is retaining a hedge. They have no existential threat that requires a nuclear weapon now. The outcome of these negotiations satisfies their national security requirements. This has been a determined and an incremental program, but it's not a crash program to get a nuclear weapon. It's not the Manhattan Project.
It's already taken longer than any other country that got a nuclear weapon has ever taken.
Any country that wants a nuclear weapon, could generally get the wherewithal to do it. Now, you brought out in your reporting from Vienna that both sides had red lines for these negotiations, and that much of the diplomatic endgame was how could these red lines be finessed. And there was a certain ambiguity built into the agreement to allow for reconciling basically incompatible red lines. So the Iranians would say, we're not dismantling anything. Well, the workout in the agreement is, we'll mothball them. We're not going to dismantle them. You laid out the various compromises. The Supreme Leader said, all sanctions are off the day the agreement's signed. Well, they cleverly came up with a structure in which there's sort of a signing day, and then there's an implementation day, and there are diplomatic ways of finessing that. But that workout left ambiguities that could be exploited. And to go to the heart of your question, what to do when Iran pushes the envelope on this agreement? And there's a charge in the paper on the A1, front part of your paper and others, Iran is cheating on the deal. If you go back to the dichotomy in this country about how the debate on Iran has been structured, there'll be immediate calls for abrogate this agreement, pull out, they cheat. It's inherent in this, you can't trust this regime. One part of this study looks, my field is essentially comparative nonproliferation. I am a huge consumer of Iran, the literature on Iran. Hala's run wonderful programs, and I've been a consumer of all these fantastic scholars that she's brought through the center, and I'm able to, as a colleague, to tap her own expertise, which has informed my own view of this question. But in this study, I talk about other states of proliferation concern, like North Korea and Libya and Iraq, and often the lessons from one of these cases is cited as an example. And North Korea comes immediately to mind because people said, look what happened with North Korea. You can't trust them. It's going to be a straight replay with Iran. Look at the details of what happened in the North Korean case. In 1994, the Clinton administration concluded the agreed framework to freeze activity at the Yongbyon facility, which was a plutonium facility. In the late 1990s, there were charges that Iran was pursuing the other route to nuclear acquisition that wasn't captured in that agreed framework, highly enriched uranium. The Bush administration confronted North Korea on the highly enriched uranium program in 2002 and abrogated the agreement. What did North Korea do? It moved the spent fuel rods from the cooling ponds, it separated plutonium, and that's where this arsenal of 6 to 10 weapons comes from. So for me, the implications of the North Korean case for Iran are, if or when Iran is accused of cheating, do not abrogate this agreement. Rather, use, and I think they were very astute in designing this, use the Joint Commission as the mechanism for addressing charges of allegation.
Well, the fact is that many of the people who negotiated this agreement had also negotiated the North Korea one, and they learned some lessons along the way.
That was a long answer to your question, but I wanted to lay some additional context.
But what we learned from, when the North Koreans cheat, they cheat big, okay? And there's nothing subtle about setting off 3 nuclear tests in a row. The Iranians, because they don't actually necessarily need a weapon right now, as you point out, but instead need the ambiguity and the likelihood that they could go get one, and figure that that brings them almost all the power of having a nuclear weapon without any of the sorrows that comes on you when you actually have one. That then suggests to me that if they do the cheating, they're cheating around the edges.
Yes.
And probably not on the highly measurable stuff. If you think about what the immediate steps are, and we ran a little, for those of you who are looking for a cheat sheet on this. Michael Gordon and I did a little question and answer thing that's in the Times today and was online yesterday about sort of what the next steps are. So they've got some big, very measurable things to do. Ship the fuel out of the country, mothball those centrifuges you discussed, change the Iraq reactor so it can't produce plutonium. If they cheated on those, it would be so obvious it probably would blow up the deal. The more likely thing is the around the edges stuff.
Yes.
And there we heard Hillary Clinton in her speech at Brookings on Wednesday argue that we had to be highly confrontational with them at the first moments of small issues, because otherwise you're setting a pattern that will only get worse as time goes on. So as you look at that North Korea example, do you agree with her? Is that what you need to do?
I agree with her, but what she's prescribing is very tough to do, because in a context where the target state is pursuing ambiguity and it's not opaque because you have IAEA inspectors there, it's still hard to determine. I mean, consider this. Syria actually used chemical weapons against the opposition, and yet the Russians, through Lavrov, were able to kick up dust and say, well, we don't really know if it was the regime that did. This is actual chemical weapon use, and they had to adjudicate that. In the Iranian case, and North Korea actually tested. Right now in the Iranian case,
Wasn't a whole lot of ambiguity around that one, was there?
no, it was not only no ambiguity; it was a totally in-your-face move to the Chinese, who were trying to turn it off. In the Iranian case, whatever we're talking about is not going to be as dramatic as, I mean, since it's a latent capability, we're not talking about a test. It would have to be something major like withdrawing from the NPT. Where the debate is moving to now is there's been discussion about whether Congress should pass a resolution that if Iran moves towards weaponization, then the United States, all options on the table, we would act. Well, determining weaponization is not so easy in the Iranian case because we're talking about a continuum of technological advance. Could the President of the United States get on television and say, Iran has exceeded the percentage of enrichment allowable under this agreement, and we're going to undertake a military action, like essentially bomb over a percentage of enriched uranium? I think that's a hard case to make, because America, after the Iraq WMD intelligence fiasco, we're not going to get the benefit of the doubt. And we saw with Syria how hard it is, even when it's overt, to get it. So this cheating around the edges, I think probably the one scenario people are talking about that would be a really create a crisis is a charge of a covert site elsewhere, a kind of a new Fordo type. And the Iranians are astute that they probably will not do that, because they know that would be discovered and would lead to a diplomatic crisis that would land them back in the Security Council.
So just think for a moment then about the other side of this, which is where the Iranians might claim that the U.S. is cheating. And that would come in the sanctions area. So we have a series of sanctions that are nuclear related. They're laid out here that are going to go get lifted, assuming the Iranians comply with the things they need to do over the next few months. And as you said, there's sort of a beginning date and then an implementation day, and the lifting doesn't happen until the implementation day. You've heard a lot of talk in Congress in the past couple of days. I was just up seeing a number of the Republican leaders 2 days ago on this, about imposing new sanctions for Iran's activities related to terrorism. These would not be nuclear-related sanctions, they would be terrorism-related sanctions. And one idea of the way to go do this is to sanction the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which also oversees the nuclear program, has a huge number of businesses within Iran, is part of the sponsorship of terrorism. But the concern here is that the Iranians could then stand up, perhaps legitimately, saying, wait a minute, you guys are doing what they do in Times Square. You're doing a little bit of like three-card Monte out here.
Right.
So you're taking former nuclear-related sanctions, you're relabeling them terrorism-related sanctions, and you're putting them on the same organizations. We call that cheating on the deal.
I think you can count on it, and we could see a replay of the debate in the 1990s over secondary sanctions, because where you can see sort of the terrain of the debate as it's going to unfold. One call will be when they cheat, ditch the agreement. Another is if they are perceived as moving on the technological continuum toward weaponization, which is President Obama's red line, bring that military option back on the table, which is a very bad option, and hence is one that the United States has reluctantly, considered. A third element of this emerging debate is let's utilize unilateral American sanctions to proscribe commercial relations with Iran by our allies, secondary sanctions, so that if Total goes in to do an oil deal with France, they would be sanctioned. In short, giving them a choice. I'm paraphrasing what the critics are saying. Do business in Iran or do business in America. And Secretary Liu in his testimony addressed that issue, that it's really a formula for a trade war with our major partners. The reason it didn't happen was in the 1990s when there was the sanctions legislation under the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. There was a waiver authority for the president, so they could basically waive its application. And then after 2006-07, when these new financial and oil sanctions came on, the ones that really had an impact in Iran, those were multilateral under the nuclear umbrella, passed by the United Nations and engineered by the United States with its European partners. Now you're asking what happens if they just try to relabel them, and that would, just as the North Koreans in the 1990s charged the United States with not complying with the agreed framework, that we weren't abiding by the sanctions relief. I think that's the line of criticism that they will register, and I would guess it would have a domestic aspect to it, because the experts on Iran and sanctions, we've had some that Hala's brought through the center. It's not going to be immediately tangible, the lifting of sanctions. It'll be something, but it's going to take a while, and it may be a good talking point for the regime to say, well, part of the reason that you're not seeing relief, I'm making up their talking point, but I get, so it's a plausible one, is because the Americans are not abiding by it.
You see this already a little bit, Rob, in the polling that's been done in Iran. There's some pretty good polling we've looked at in the past week or so, in which you had Iranians say they overwhelmingly support the deal, that they expect that sanctions will be lifted on the first day of the deal, not on implementation day, which tells you a lot about what the regime has sort of let out, and that it's a very good thing that the regime held tough and that there can be no inspections of military sites under this, which is also not part of it. So you can imagine a moment in which there could be a significant rift in that regard. Let me take you to your points about containment and your references back to Kennan and so forth. So when Secretary Clinton gave her speech the other day, it was basically a speech about containment. It was saying, I think this is the right deal, but it only works if you set it into the broader context of a containment strategy for the rest of their power in the Middle East. Why wasn't that the speech that President Obama gave at American University in July when he went out to make his big public case for this?
Yeah. As Andrew Seeley said, that kind of the big issue in international relations that I've looked at in my three-part series on rogue to outlier states has been, how do you reintegrate diplomatically isolated states into the system? What are the strategies of engagement and containment that can be fashioned and targeted? And I see Bruce Gendels in the audience. We've collaborated on project at the Wilson Center going back into the 90s and worked on these issues in parallel. It's how do you bring them in from the cold? America's grand strategy is integration. We pursued it kind of brilliantly with Germany and Japan after World War II. Truman cited it as the great success of his foreign policy. that is our preferred approach. Now, when that preferred option is not available because the target state is not interested in integrating into the system, because the regime views that process of integration as a threat to regime survival, our default alternative is containment. It's not hard regime change as was done in Iraq in 2003. We are currently pursuing a strategy of containment toward Iran in form but not in name. And one of the goals of this book has been to rehabilitate the term containment. And as with the work I did on rogue states, it's not some fetishism about language, but it's rather the approach to the policy that undergirds the term, because that is the key to a containment strategy. Now here's the last bit, and it's in the book, and it's somewhat subtle, that containment essentially is a strategy of regime change, but one over time. And here, Obama, back to transactional transformational, Obama has made the case for this deal in transactional terms. He is a card-carrying utilitarian. What works, what's in America's interest. And he's addressing the nuclear threat, and this is the best way of buying 15 years. But implicit in this transaction is a transformational hope, namely that if you buy 15 years, that Iran as a society will be in a different place. The Supreme Leader, with his focus on regime survival and how to manage this identity crisis, revolutionary state, ordinary country, he's made another bet, a tacit bet, which is that he can control these forces, that the deep state, the autocratic deep state can keep a lid on these forces, so that Obama views this deal as opening the door to transformation. It's a hope. For the Supreme Leader, it's a fear. And that's another dimension of the argument that I present in this book. And all the arguments we've been talking about, the points I've been making here, and I say this as an author who just brought out a book, and I don't want the Senate just vote to say, like, hey, too bad, your book's dead on arrival, it's over, the Senate just voted on. This is going to take a long time to implement, and the analysis in this book will, so to speak, have some shelf life to inform our understanding, hopefully, of issues that arise in implementation.
Well, let me just ask you one or two more things, and then I want to get a chance to see if anybody in the audience has got a few questions along the way. So as you think about the next 2 years out, some big decisions have to be made by the Iranians, by the Americans, and the Israelis. So for the Americans, in addition to the sanctions question, there's the question of sabotage. Mm-hmm. Many of us have spent a lot of years writing about what it is that the United States, Israel, European allies have done to slow down the Iranian program. And while politicians talk publicly about the sanctions part and how it brought the Iranians to the table.
I seem to recall a front page article in the New York Times about Stuxnet.
More than one,
yeah.
probably about 50, and a book. So we've had big sabotage programs. Some of them have been physical sabotage. Some of them have been cyber sabotage.
Right.
If you're the Israelis and you look at this deal, which you desperately wanted to stop and failed to, do you continue the sabotage program? If you're the Americans and you look at this deal that you desperately wanted to go ahead, but you're worried about the Iranians cheating on the edges, do you go ahead with the sabotage program?
This is, I don't mean to duck the question, but this is really where the policy research agenda is shifting toward. It's time. We need research in the area on cyber, and someone has a book in mind, perhaps on the issue of cyber, because it cuts both ways. We saw during the Libyan 2011 intervention reporting that the United States had refrained from using some cyber capabilities in that conflict because out of concern about setting a precedent of using cyber, an offensive cyber. I've been in meetings on Iran nuclear where in the discussion of options, there's been reference to cyber and a proposal like, why are we talking about bombing nuclear infrastructure if we really wanted to send a message to Iran that was non-lethal, use cyber to have societal impacts. It's less than the kinetic options. Israel will make its own determination. I think several years ago they came to the conclusion that a military mission, kind of an OSIRAC, the 1981 bombing of the Iraqi reactor, was not a feasible mission for them given the redundancy of Iran's capabilities, the distances involved, and the ability of Iran to reconstitute the program pretty quickly. So Israel may, that would be an attractive option for them. They'd have to game out the consequences of it. For the United States, while if hopefully the implementation is proceeding smoothly, I think there would be an inhibition to do those kinds of operations for fear of tanking the agreement.
Let's flip that on its head and now talk about the Iranian options. So they're going to have released something between $56 billion and $150 billion, depending on whose numbers you believe here. And a lot of that's going to go to domestic infrastructure, and Rouhani's got to show that there are benefits from this. But somebody's got to pay off the IRGC, right? I mean, here they've just given up for the next 10 to 15 years, presumably, unless they come up with a very effective way of cheating and not getting caught. They've just given up a project in which they have invested their hopes and billions of dollars. So if you're the supreme leader, do you say, you can do this with missiles to Hezbollah, you can do this with terrorist activity, or they've got their own cyber core. And you can say, yeah, I read through all 156 pages of this nuclear agreement, doesn't say one thing about using cyber weapons. So go for it, boys.
Iran has, will manage its complex and somewhat contradictory set of interests, within this context. We've had discussions at the Wilson Center of how the nuclear portfolios with Rouhani and Zarif and the regional policies in Syria and Lebanon are with the Quds Force. And there's been this division of labor, so to speak, within the regime, and in part reflecting this divide within the regime over which way it wants to go. When Rouhani went to Davos the year after he was, the winter after he was elected, someone gushed that Iran is now, this is their, coming out party and rejoining the international system. But this deep state remains. I recall, we were emailing back when you were, when the Lausanne Agreement, another hardship posting for you.
Yeah, it was awful.
You were in Lausanne. And
some days you only got crepes 3 times a day.
Yeah. And we were talking about this divide between revolutionary state, ordinary country. And you in an email just sort of said to me, which is it? I mean, the problem is I'm dealing with all the ordinary country guys here, and they're on the phone to Tehran, and they're talking to the revolutionary state guys. Can they do a deal? So that when in Vienna, when they were in Endgame, I think it was in your reporting, Kerry just boldly asked Zarif, can you do this deal? Are you speaking on behalf of the supreme leader? Because in 2009, I don't know if you did the Vienna one.
I did,
They did a less ambitious Vienna deal. They took it back to Tehran, and it just couldn't survive.
It actually got killed in the supreme leader's office.
Yeah.
Right.
So, as we move forward, our discussions on the Middle East. We've had distinguished scholars come through and eminent historians of the Middle East, and they say they don't recall a period where the region has been as complex and such disarray, and it's hard to kind of make sense of what's going on. I went to graduate school in England where they always would put some kind of declaratory sentence and then say discuss in quotation marks. And so it's like right now the United States is tacitly allied with Iraq in Iran, with Iran in Iraq against ISIS. ISIS is tacitly supported by the Sunnis, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, or at least elements within those countries. In Syria, we're opposed to Iran, which is backing Assad, and our notional allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, are pursuing their own agendas, which for Turkey means, bombing the Kurds. And so you take that and just say, okay, where's your coherent strategy within that context? How do you do it? And I think that one of the criticisms made of Iran in the context of this deal is, look how much American blood is on Iran's hands, that the Quds Force through the IEDs in Iraq killed hundreds of Americans during the Iraq War, don't do a deal. We're now, someone put it, we're providing essentially air cover for the Quds Force in Iraq to take on an ISIS, which is embedded with the Shiite militias. So that it's going to require complex management on our side to maintain a broader political environment within which this deal can be pursued. And on the Iranian side, they're going to have to make similar calculations, because last point before you open it up to the audience, we saw in 2002 when there was, after the invasion of after 9/11, and the United States was taking down the Taliban Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which was harboring Al-Qaeda, there was an alignment of interest between Iran and the United States, but that all came apart when the Korean A was discovered shipping arms to the Palestinians, and that's how Iran made it into the axis of evil speech in the January 2002 State of the Union.
Well, as you guys can tell, Rob and I could spend hours bouncing this stuff back and forth, and we've been known to over the time, but it would be selfish of me. So let me call on a few folks and see if we can get, we've got about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Gentleman right in the back there, yeah. Yes, sir.
There's a microphone.
Microphone coming your way.
Just please identify yourself.
Dave DeRoche, the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. The United States' preferred mode of putting pressure on Iran has been sanctions. The Iranian regime's preferred mode of putting pressure on the United States and its allies has been terrorism. This agreement constrains the United States, but not Iran. Discuss.
He must have gone to school in Britain. Yeah.
I'm a graduate of London University.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
there you go.
This is really kind of the structural dilemma of the deal, that it addresses the nuclear but not kind of other areas of concern, because it's a deal, not a grand bargain. It's transactional, and this goes to David's point about the speech that Hillary Clinton gave yesterday, and what President Obama says is we have to do our part to check Iran's activism where it conflicts with American interests. In some areas, like in Iraq, they align. And so this is the complexity of the debate. It's not kind of white hats, black hats. We are working pragmatically working with Iran in certain contexts and at odds with them at others. Tom Friedman had a column during the context of this debate where someone said Iran is the greatest threat to the region, and Tom's provocative counterpoint was 15 of 19, 9/11. Saudi Arabia has been fueling this radical sect of Sunni Islam and is destabilizing the region. So it's a very complex situation, and I say that not just as sort of a way of avoiding your question, but it really will come down almost to, we need a strategy that allows us to address each of these areas of concern in their own terms. I've been trying to resurrect, to me, the grand strategy that fits those components is a containment strategy. Unfortunately, the term has been eschewed from our debate, but in practice, we are meeting it. Now, to do what is the thrust behind your question, doing our part, it's very hard in a domestic context where, and I think it played out in the Iran debate, there is no public support for re-engagement in the Middle East. I mean, Obama thought he was getting us out of the region, and ironically, Iran, because Iraq is no longer a counterweight, Sunni counterweight to Iran in the region, Iraq has been empowered in the region. It's pursuing its options, but that the United States will have to check Iran's power in a context where the U.S. domestic support is not there for re-engagement in the region. We're going to be re-engaged in the region because of the nuclear deal, because of ISIS. And managing the domestic politics of it here is going to be a major challenge for our executive.
Holly?
Just quick question to both of you. The IAEA must play a very important role starting next week or whatever. Do they have the means? Do they have the manpower? And do they have the money?
We have one of our scholars here this year is working on a history of the IAEA. So we're going to put this question into a historical context. And I note that one of the members of Congress wanted to link funding for the American support for IAEA to their objections to this deal. That's not going to get anywhere, but it's sort of in our churn of politics here, that's been thrown out as a possibility. The IAEA record is a balance sheet that they didn't do so well in North Korea in the early 1990s. They did well in Iraq in later in that decade, and were accurate on the WMD's assessment that Iraq did not have a nuclear weapons program. And Charles Dulfer, the former UNSCOM inspector, was a fellow here. And has written recently about that experience. But the Secretary Moniz has pointed to technological advances on monitoring, as well as the importance of the physical presence in the country that will give us the best, in this opaque context of the Iran nuclear program, will give us the best information on that program. And reasonably high confidence that either by the IAEA or through other intelligence services that major cheating is in a covert facility would be discovered.
Well, Holly, you addressed the question to me as well, and I agree with everything that Rob said, and let me just add a few things. You asked means, manpower, and money, and I would add one more, which is spine. Okay? So do they have the means? Yes, they do for the limited inspections they've been asked to go do. Do they need some more money to do it? Yes, but it's in the realm of tens of millions of dollars. It is not, a huge investment compared to the other investments that have been made in this project. Do they have the manpower? They currently have about 50 people who specifically do Iran now. I think to really do the inspections at the depth that the agreement calls for. My friends inside the IAEA, they haven't made any public assessments of this, tell me 100 to 150, but again, we're not talking a huge bureaucracy here. Spine is going to be the more immediate question, and here's why. First, there are these two agreements, which if you're a Republican Congress is a secret side agreement, and if you're an IAEA inspector is a normal country to IAEA confidential agreement, which lay out the rules under which they are going to collect at Parchin, which is a suspected former nuclear site that has been so redecorated and clean now you could probably eat off of the ground without fear of radioactive contamination. And then the mechanism for answering the dozen questions on possible military dimensions that Iran has evaded now for 6 or 7 years running. My guess is that their conclusion on the dozen questions is going to be inconclusive. And that will be fine with the United States, which has essentially said at this point that they're less interested in what went on in the past than what goes on in the future. There's some risk in that position, because if you don't have a baseline about how far they got, it's sort of difficult 10 years from now when the R&D starts up to know whether they're making progress beyond that. And there's a risk for the IAEA, which doesn't want to get into a situation where any country can resist inspection and know that, in the end, you can sort of work this out on the side with the United States, and maybe the P5 and those nasty inspectors with their nasty questions will go away. And so I think that's the biggest reputational risk to the IAEA over the next few months.
Just one point on the issue of risk. I mean, you're reporting, you're in Vienna, and you had good sources on how they finessed this issue of dueling red lines, which looked irreconcilable, and how they did what creative diplomats do to kind of to get to yes. when a lot of people didn't think that we could get to yes because of this defining issue on both sides, particularly in Iran, of whether it was prepared to do a deal with the great Satan. But it really comes down to an issue of managing risks. And I have the piece I'm presenting today provides context and sort of an analytical framework for viewing it. I think you could probably glean from it where I come down on this issue, but it's not a hard advocacy piece. And I do emphatically state that on the issue of managing risks, reasonable people can disagree.
Okay, so we have a few minutes for just a couple more. Gentlemen right here on the edge.
Bruce Gentleson.
Yeah, I'm Jed Schilling with the Millennium Institute. I've got two questions. One, you'd mentioned the comparison with North Korea, but there's a significant difference between Iran and North Korea, because North Korea is very isolationist, and Iran has connections, and from people I know who visited there and stuff, want more integration and connections with the global economy beyond just the oil. So to what extent do you think that this kind of an agreement with the reduction of sanctions and things will lead to maybe a regime modification or moderation and reduce the risk of violence and increase their integration into the global economy, which will make them want to stay more stable for a long period of time? They have a tradition of being a major power in the region, so that's what they want to establish. The second question, and you can be quite brief on this, is if for some reason this agreement were ultimately rejected in the United States, what would the major risks of that be to relations with Iran, with our neighbors, the 5 other countries who were involved in the agreement, and would that be other challenges that come up from that?
It's in our own categorization, we kind of look at different states in relation to each other, and I know I have enough Iranian friends that it really drives them nuts when they're even considered in the same breath as North Korea, which is this, bizarre kind of isolated state, and the GDP of it is probably, equivalent to McLean, Virginia, as opposed to, they're highly nationalist, but they don't have the different historical tradition than Iran. And interestingly, President Obama in his statements about Iran cite Iran as being a great civilization. You glean from his statements that he really admires Iran in a way he does not Saudi Arabia, for example. I mean, that's sort of kind of implicit in it. Your first question is basically the big question on Iran, whether and how they can reintegrate into the system or not. The regime is hesitant because integration is viewed as a threat to regime survival, and they are trying to manage that tension. President Obama, talked about that if we don't do this deal, it will lead to war. And I understand kind of where he was going, and you can connect the dots to get to war. But a breakdown of diplomacy, if this agreement were not implemented, or at least by the United States, a breakdown of diplomacy would not lead to a breakout by Iran, because Iran has no urgency for a weapon. If the United States rejected it, we would become the issue in international relations, not Iran. And Iran would astutely kind of make America the issue in international relations.
We have time for just one more. Bruce?
Thanks. Bruce Gentleson, my multiple identities, Duke University professor, global fellow here, and now Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress. But great work, great discussion. And I want to pick up on the context that you raised, because ultimately, even though it's a transactional deal, it will, survive or not based upon the specifics that you both were talking about, but also the broader context and the whole question of containment. And I think of Kennan on containment, where he basically said right in Europe, wrong in the rest of the world, and he dissented on Vietnam and the others. And the United States ran into a lot of traps and problems as we applied containment in the Cold War throughout the world. So how do we deal with this in the Middle East, where it means pushback on Iran in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Syria? And how do we avoid the traps where it can lead to the further radicalization of the Shia in Bahrain? We're on the side we don't really know who we're supporting in Syria. We may give the Saudis too much running room, and as you said, they're also a source of problems. I mean, the whole question of this sort of seems logical that you push back on them and maybe they make concessions, but it seems like there are a lot of landmines there for us as well in terms we figure out how we deal with the rest of the region.
Bruce asked an excellent question, and let me make it even harder, which is, you've got a political atmosphere in which you can do containment economically, you can do containment from the air to some degree, you can do some out in the sea, but you can't do it on the ground in any casualty creating way, which was not a constraint that we had during the Cold War.
The uber critique of Obama is that he's overreacting to Bush, that if Bush did too much, Obama is doing too little. And I was on the lawn in front of the Capitol when President Bush gave his second inaugural address, where he laid out the rather modest objective of U.S. foreign policy, which is to eliminate tyranny in the world, and was all in on a kind of nation-building approach. President Obama is much more cautious on this notorious sort of leading from behind comment. He did not, I got the sense, he did not want to do the Libyan intervention, but
and now thinks maybe he didn't do it hard enough.
well, if you were going to do it, you needed to do more, to going into it. But essentially came down to a determination that, when Britain, France, and Italy go to war, the United States can't just walk away from, go away from that. So the Europeans really took the lead on Libyan. But undergirding the Obama approach, and you see it, you can glean it from the interviews he's done with Tom Friedman, Jeff Goldberg, yourself, is this fundamental issue of agency in international relations. And we have a lot of historians, it's one of our strengths at the Wilson Center. Historians talk about agency all the time. And for Obama, it's a question of, is external agency, can an external power be an agent of change in a region? Or does the very process of getting engaged as an external power have consequences? So that, the United States is involved in Afghanistan. It is not a war to extract tribute, resources from Afghanistan, which doesn't have any. It was an altruistic intervention. It was self-interested because Al-Qaeda had taken it over, used it as a base to attack us. But staying there was about trying to turn Afghanistan into a more decent place. And you get this green on blue violence of Afghan nationals who don't want foreigners in their country killing Americans who are there for altruistic reasons. I think Obama's sense is that there's limited sway that foreign powers can have, but this Middle East is not Europe. There's much less there to work with. There are not the institutions, as we saw in Libya, and there's not a political culture for a lot of these states. I think Tom Friedman called them the straight line states that were just sort of carved out of Sykes-Picot, et cetera. Working this process in this context is just inherently thorny, and the role of outsiders can cut either way.
Well, it's a little known fact about the Wilson Center's move into the Ronald Reagan building, but they, down in the basement, they put in a small torture center for moderators who keep panels going beyond their allotted time. And so not wanting to get dropped into that on the way out, I want to thank you, Rob, for an amazing piece of work. I want to thank the audience for their great questions. I'm sure there are many that we didn't get to, and Rob will be around.
And there are copies of this at popular prices outside the door.
That's right.
So.
And I thank you all for coming, and thank you, Rob, for this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, David.